Hello everyone, I trust the sound is good and that you can hear me. If there's an issue, this is a sound test. Okay, that seems to be synced right now. In honor of our discussion tonight on the Spirit Mercurius from Dr. Jung's book, Alchemical Studies, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes, I thought I would warm up by reading an essay that I wrote in 2015. And it's called I'm Mercurius. And hi, Dan, thanks for letting me know. So I'm referring to my website, archetypeinaction.com, where this appears, and it was published in May of 2015. I'm Mercurius. Everyone who publishes something on this website is a cave diver, just as Mercury was. The cave we explore is the unconscious, which is the greatest part of the human psyche. It is a vast territory, every bit as big as the external universe, because the universe is contained within it. But comparatively little is known about it. We know it makes our heart beat, our lungs breathe, our cells reproduce, in addition to sending us inscrutable messages through dreams and visions. But further explanation and research is needed, desperately needed. When I was in the second grade, my teacher taught us of our solar system. I found that first introduction to astronomy fascinating. It started to explain what we often see in the night sky. I became conscious of some of the things humanity knew at the time, but as I've aged, I've learned how little we knew then, and how much there is yet to explore, especially in the unconscious. In 1996, astronomers turned the Hubble Space Telescope toward an empty patch of sky for 10 days, not knowing if the images would be blank when they finished. When they looked at their images, they found over 3,000 new galaxies. Repeating the experiment in 2004, they found no less than 10,000 new galaxies, each with hundreds of millions of stars never seen before. There's a link to the Hubble Ultra Deep Field in 3D video, which is on YouTube. It's 4 minutes long, and it's definitely worth your time. The link is below what you're looking at now. Regarding the unconscious universe, however, we know much less. Indeed, Drs. Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud studied it for their entire lives and brought up many discoveries, but in the end, Dr. Jung himself admitted that we know nothing about the inner universe. He said, quote, "The world hangs on a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man. Nowadays, we are not threatened by elementary catastrophes. There is no such thing as an H-bomb. That is all man's doing. We are the great danger. Psyche is the great danger. What if something goes wrong with the psyche? And so it is demonstrated in our days what the power of the psyche is of man, how important it is to know something about it, but we know no thing about it." And that was from, you can find this quote on Face to Face with Carl Jung, which was broadcast by the BBC in 1956. Dr. Jung's quote was a little over the top in the sense of the fact that he wrote an entire shelf of books on exactly what we do know, thanks in large part to his research. One of the concepts he presented was the existence of archetypes, which the ancient Greeks called gods. Ancient Greeks knew that they were energized by certain powers from time to time, and over thousands of years they differentiated these forces into categories they called gods. Nothing has changed for modern humanity, except today we call those forces archetypes and recognize them as constellations of the collective unconscious of humanity. They exist everywhere and in most other species besides humans. All one needs to do is watch one of the web cameras on sites like explore.org to see just how strong the mother archetype is in all species. All of us experience many archetypes bubbling up into our conscious thoughts during our lifetime, and all of us have a natural tendency to follow one or two of them throughout life. The primary ones that energize me are Mercury, Hermes, and Vulcan, Hephaestus. Mercury, Hermes, was the god who went into the deep unconscious and brought what he found into consciousness. He has also been called the messenger of the gods. Vulcan was the god who built things at his forge. My primary tendencies are quite obvious in looking at the Archetype in Action organization website as well as this YouTube channel, which I built and curate, where all of us try to bring unconscious information into consciousness. The role of writers, musicians, artists, dancers, singers, chefs, photographers, and all other creative people has been to help us understand something we do not know. Indeed, in order to make anything, you must first imagine it. This is not a rational task. Look around the room in which you are sitting at this very moment. With the exception of plants, everything that you can see first appeared in someone's fantasy. Even you would not be here if your father and mother had not imagined something, and all of those visions emerged from the unconscious psyche. Logic and rational thought can take you just so far, but in order to experience meaning, you have to first imagine something and feel it too. This is why something like the Hubble Ultra Deep Field video is so important. Someone can tell you about it until they're blue in the face, but until you have watched the Ultra Deep Field video, you cannot appreciate the value of what the astronomers did. It is truly profound. In the same sense, a piece of art, as abstract as a Pollock, has tremendous value, but you cannot possibly understand that until you have experienced it for yourself. But you cannot possibly understand that until you have experienced it for yourself. In general, I am not hugely moved by paintings in art galleries, but when I saw Jackson Pollock, number 31, 1950, in real life, I spontaneously burst into tears. To this day, I don't know why, but it gave me new respect, even love, for his work. You cannot get the same result from looking at a postcard or online image of the painting, and your experience will necessarily be different from mine. And as most of you know, I since do know what caused me to break into tears, and there's video on this YouTube channel which shows the moment when I realized what it meant to me. And that certainly came from the unconscious. Was Pollock painting a portrait of his own soul? Maybe, but if so, he was painting a portrait of your soul as well. But you will never understand that unless you see one of these paintings in real life. Then you will know, and your life will be changed because of your knowing. Try it. The same thing happened to me, by the way, with Monet. I used to see little postcards of Monet lily ponds, for example, and I always said, so what? But when we had a Monet exhibit here in Baltimore at the Walters Art Gallery, I said, oh my God, it was amazing. Even God is found in the unconscious psyche and nowhere in the known physical universe to date. When Dr. Jung, the son of a Swiss Reformed pastor, was asked if he believed in God, he said, I have no need to believe, I know. He went further in his writing, but, quote, but religious statements without exception have to do with the reality of the psyche and not with the reality of the faces. That's from Answer to Job, paragraph 752. When rationalistic patriarchs want to cut us off from the arts by canceling art and music classes and defending the arts in general, isn't it time for us to fight back? They are only manipulating us by denying our humanity, not to mention cutting us off from the ingenuity that made America the dominant economic power it is. And I would, as an aside, tell a story of Winston Churchill. During World War II, he was asked why he was continuing to fund the British Museum. And he said, well, if we don't fund the British Museum, then what are we fighting for? How would the world be changed if we all understood every religious idea of every religion is absolutely true as a psychic fact? What do you think that means to you? What does it mean to the rest of us? Do you believe or do you know? In the end, every painting, every piece of music, every religious event of whatever kind is a direct communication from the unconscious of the artist or organizers of religion directly into the unconscious of the rest of us. No number of critics, describers, scientists, or rationalists will ever be able to explain their meaning to you. Only you can decide their meaning. If you don't experience them, you will never know. Okay, so that was in 2015. Obviously, it has a certain amount of dated features in it. But I thought it might be an interesting way to warm up for tonight's group session. And so let's... Okay, so now I'll look back at comments and questions, and then we'll move into the Spirit Mercurius. Dan says, I become conscious of the shadow involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is the essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge. Certainly that's true. And it therefore, as a rule, meets with considerable resistance. That's what Dan's quoting Carl Jung. Thomas says, we have a statue of Vulcan here in Birmingham. What I didn't put up, but I will now. Here's a picture of Vulcan, which is in my essay, and you'll find a link to my essay under this video right now, in case you want to look at it. But anyway, that's Vulcan at his forge making things. And so, as you see, the two gods that rule my life are Mercury, Hermes, who brings things from the unconscious and presents them to the world. That's what I'm doing here. And Hephaestus, Vulcan, who makes things. And so here I'm making a website. So these are my natural psychic inclinations. you could say. And so now there's two websites, archetypeinaction.com, and then this YouTube channel as well. So thank you for mentioning Vulcan so I could get that image in. It actually came in the middle of that essay. But anyway, and thank you for agreeing with my point about seeing paintings in person. You know, there's so many paintings that I've seen pictures of in books, and I go, you know, who cares? But when you see them in person, they just are breathtaking, and it really is important. And you don't know how they affect you. In other words, when I used to do tarot readings for people, I used to say that I was moving the furniture around in their unconscious. And that's basically what you're doing. You're constellating certain archetypes and maybe crushing out others, I don't know. But in any case, you're stimulating the unconscious in a tarot reading. And that's what happens when you go to an art museum too. It's also what happens when you do art. And so in my case, just to give you an example, and this probably has happened to most men who are watching this. If you go to Sears Roebuck and go in the tool section, you start looking around and say, oh man, I really need that circular saw, or I really need that drill press, or whatever it is. And you might fill up your basement with a bunch of fancy tools from Sears, and then it remains to be seen whether you ever get down and use them. But the same happens if you go to Michael's or you go to an art supply store. If you ever had any inclination toward drawing, you suddenly feel an urge to, you know, buy a small watercolor set or whatever it is and start painting. And actually in 1995, I did that. I bought a watercolor set and I put it in a backpack, and I was walking my collies every day to a beautiful overlook place, which we have in my community, which overlooks the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. And so it looks out on the Severn River, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, and the eastern shore of Maryland on the other side. And so every morning at 6 a.m., I was painting a sunrise of that. And over a period of about 2.5, 3 years, I painted more than 600 of these paintings. I took 15 minutes to do it, and some of them came out quite nicely. And then as I continued to do that, I started to get a little bit more interested in art, and that stimulated some thinking. And so I used the opportunity as a kind of meditation. And during the next 10 years, I painted hundreds of paintings in oils, in acrylics, in watercolor. And some of them are quite well appreciated by my friends whose portraits I painted, for example, and some not, by the way. The statue here, Thomas says, the statue here moons folks on the south side of the Red Mountain. Hermes is also the god of thieves, yes, and artists who often steal from reality to portray useful fictions. That's certainly true. And so Hermes and Mercury, I was going to mention that there is a shadow side, and that shadow side is the trickster. And so a trickster I have been. In other words, I've done things that people weren't expecting me to do from time to time. And we know that the President of the United States was a trickster when he captured the presidency by focusing on the Electoral College, which was something that I had observed long ago would be possible, but he effectuated it, and that got him into the presidency. And most Americans were completely blindsided by that. So that was a trickster thing to do. And so the problem with the trickster is that it is a shadow side feature of the Spirit Mercurius, the spirit, and it may not stand up over time. Time will tell. We'll see. And Andy says, are you a fan of Dali? I'm bemused by Dali. I love the picture of him. Maybe it was in Playboy magazine, of his big handlebar mustache and his special look, that photograph. And I do like the Dali of the Last Supper, which is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. But other things of Dali's I didn't really understand until I started to study Jung and started to understand Jung's consternation with modern art, because what Jung understood was that modern art, as it started to emerge in the 19-teens especially, was very, full of dream material and very different from anything anybody had seen in an art gallery before that. A lot of people didn't think that it was art at all, including Dr. Jung. But, over time, he came to understand it as representations of the unconscious and the psychic turmoil, the mental turmoil that the whole world, the collective unconscious, was in. And the art was a reflection of that, and is a reflection of that. And Thomas says, Magritte is my favorite with Bosch and Pollock. Okay, great. I can't immediately put my mind on a Magritte at the moment, or a Bosch, but anyway. And Hermit Nick says, Toth is my homeboy. Well, there are many. Obviously, Escher is one, as you say. He pulled some amazing things out, and obviously they're shaking loose something in all of our unconsciouses when they do that. They're telling us something that we need to know, and so the issue that you need, what we all need to start doing, is start going to movies and art galleries and listening to music and seeing what it is that these artists are telling us about the collective unconscious. Because, in our day-to-day lives, most of us are filled with, running here, running there, doing everything. And it's very hard to really work out what's going on in society and what's going on in the collective unconscious. And that's a real issue when you get into this Spirit Mercurius that we're going to talk about here in a few moments. But if we all start to go to art galleries and instead of looking at them and saying, oh, I like that or I don't like that, the correct question is, what are they telling us? Where is that coming from in their psyche, and what is the message that it's giving us? I had a question yesterday, I think. I don't recall the exact question, but it was something about art and painting. And the point that I made is that a painter doesn't necessarily know how you will take a painting. And when they do a painting, they just launch it. And it's like a baby, and they don't know whether the baby is going to grow up to be a great masterpiece or is going to get thrown in the ash can. And so, and it's very common for a painter to go to an exhibition of their own work and show it to somebody else, and that other person might have a completely different idea about what the painting means than the painter. And that's partially because for the painter it was coming from the unconscious, and it might still be unconscious. He might still be communicating something to the other person, but he might not know what that is. So in the case of the Pollock, which was on those videos of mine, it occurred to me finally that was a direct message from the unconscious of Jackson Pollock to my unconscious, without passing through either of our conscious minds. And so that's essentially what art is. And so after I had my aha moment on that Pollock painting, which you can see here, then it manifested, then it came out of the unconscious, and I could know what it was. And I'll put a link to that video beneath this video, but anyway, I don't want to dwell on that, but obviously art of all kinds is important to us, and we all ought to be asking ourselves, what is this person saying to us? What is the message? And that goes for every novel. It goes for every movie. And, I think it was about 3-4 years ago, I was going into the movie theater, and there were all these posters about zombie wars and, all kinds of wars, the Transformers and so on. And I said, oh my God, what is going on in the unconscious of Americans that these movie makers feel we need these images? And that's a real question. I mean, it's changed somewhat since then, but it's pretty rare these days that I even want to go and put that stuff in my mind. For example, I don't go to vampire movies or horror movies. I think there are enough horrors in our lives as it is, and I don't voluntarily put those images into my mind, because there are vampires in the world, and they are the 1%, and they are sucking all the juice out of our country, and have been for the last 40 years. They've worked it out, set it up in such a way that they can suck all the juice out of the country. And just today I learned that the GOP has voted to take dental care away from veterans who have earned dental care. Well, I don't know about you, but when I was working for my Marine Corps retirement, as far as I was concerned and am concerned today, the benefits that I was earning and were promised to me by my government are a contract between me and my government. And I don't believe that I can accept the idea that one political party can choose to just take those benefits away after I've done my 23 years. What's their right to take that away? And the same is true with Social Security, of course. And so those are very deeply felt issues for me, especially as I'm retired, and so I'm reliant on those sources of income. And as it happens, I don't think I personally am entitled to dental service or ever was entitled to dental service through the Veterans Administration. But for men who are entitled to it, that's a big issue. So Thomas has just rewatched Meetings with Remarkable Men about Gurdjieff. Certainly, Gurdjieff is an amazing guy. I haven't read anything of his probably in 20 years, and because I'm trying to keep my focus on Jung now, I haven't gone back. So anyway, but some of these videos that come up, documentaries that come up, I do watch. I think there's going to be a very interesting one that's coming out, I think, in the next week, called Christopher Robin, which is about the writing of Winnie the Pooh. And I think all of us probably had a Winnie the Pooh experience in our childhood. And so I think it will be interesting to see how the movie makers now portray how Winnie the Pooh came into being. And that seems to be the topic of the movie, although you can't tell very much from the trailers. Right, and Thomas asks rightly about the fairy tale about Mercurius, and I'm about to read that, Thomas, so give me a moment and I will read that. Anyway, okay, so I wanted to go back and say, okay, we're talking about we're talking about alchemical studies, and so what Jung was doing here, and this was an early book, and the Spirit Mercurius came out the first time in 1942, so it was for him, it was 3 years into World War II. And so he was trying to offer things kind of sub rosa, but trying to help people think about what it is we're all doing. And so this article is quite long. It's nearly 60 pages long. And I often say that Dr. Jung's, I mention his prodigious scholarship. And I think that the things that he was dredging up that nobody else wanted to talk or think about were different enough so that he felt that he had to put all the predicates all the way along. And so what he has done in many of his books is gone back to the beginnings of human thought and shown how things have developed right up to his day. And in the case of the Spirit Mercurius, what he's talking about is the spirit that makes anything happen. Okay, it's not one thing. It's not like a god. And it's really not Mercury or Hermes. It is the spirit that makes anything happen. And he goes through in this essay all the different ways of understanding Mercurius. And so in the summary again, which I read briefly last week, but I'll mention again, he highlights 6 main aspects of Mercurius. So number 1, Mercurius consists of all conceivable opposites. He is thus quite obviously a duality, but is named a unity in spite of the fact that his innumerable inner contradictions can dramatically fly apart into an equal number of disparate and apparently independent figures. So, first of all, the spirit is all opposites. And the point about that is that psychic energy comes from opposites. And this was one of the main things that Dr. Jung talked about in his career. And just mention again this book, Psychic Energy by M. Esther Harding. Dr. Harding was a first-generation follower of Dr. Jung. She visited him in Switzerland many times and participated in many of his long lecture series. And she wrote that this book was published in 1949. It's called Psychic Energy, Its Source and Its Transformation. And it's a brilliant book because it really tells you with an overview of what Dr. Jung's work was all about. And one of the key elements that it was about was psychic energy. So Dr. Jung liked to use the metaphor of up to down and the waterfall, and saying how energy is produced by water going from the top down the waterfall to the bottom, and obviously you can generate electricity that way, among other things. But then the water goes back in a cycle and condenses again and goes back up into the sky. So then that's, whatever convection causes convection. I guess it's heat causes the water to evaporate and rise into the sky again. Then it falls back down and it comes back down over the waterfall once again. And so those opposites of energy production are exactly metaphorical of the energy production that happens in the psyche. So what Dr. Jung is saying here in the summary is that Mercurius represents all conceivable opposites. Number 2, he's both material and spiritual. And as we'll get into it, I hope tonight, Dr. Jung, when he's talking about the spirit being material, he's talking about the Philosopher's Stone being the matrix, okay, the matrix of the solidified matrix, okay, and obviously the spiritual aspect is pretty clear. Now let's see. Thomas, I'm not following Andy's comment, but Thomas says, I ran across a great book once called Alchemical Psychology by a guy named Tom Cavalli. Old Recipes for Living in a New World was very helpful to me. Ray, technical alchemy terms and processes. Tom Cavalli is a well-known Jungian analyst, and I know of the book. I haven't actually heard it, but there's also, let's see if I have it here on my iPhone. There is also a terrific, where did I put it? There's a terrific either book or lecture by Hillman. It was a 3-day workshop he did on alchemy. And basically what he was talking about was, it's a book by James Hillman called The Alchemy of Psychology. And what he did in that, and I have it as an audio book, and what he did was go through all of alchemy, and his audience was psychotherapists. So he was talking about all the alchemical procedures as they relate to psychotherapy. And so that's a very useful seminar that he ran. It was a 3-day seminar, so there's about 10 hours of material there, maybe even more. And it gets pretty detailed, but it's definitely worth going through at least once to understand. Reminds me. And Andy asks, has anyone read the 7 Sermons of the Dead? Well, anyone who's read the Red Book will have read the 7 Sermons of the Dead. And that's an essential part of understanding Dr. Jung's visioning period. He, let's say in the 30s and 40s, maybe the 50s, he kind of regretted the publication of 7 Sermons of the Dead. He had written it as a birthday gift for someone, and he had a small publication of it done, and somehow it managed to find its way out into the public domain. And what it is a part of his visioning process. And because it happened in 1915 and 1916, I believe, it was obviously during a very emotional time for Europeans, and particularly for Swiss, because they were surrounded by this war for at least 6 years of active war, and before the active war, about a decade of very threatening times before the war broke out. And I'm sorry, I'm conflating World War II with World War I, but this was World War I. And so obviously Dr. Jung was very emotionally upset at that time, and that actually resulted in him discovering the collective unconscious, because he had those 5 visions of the war, the beginning of the war, before it actually broke out. And that was actually how he realized the collective unconscious existed, because he had experienced it himself. And but he said about 7 Sermons of the Dead that was a youthful indiscretion, because when it got out into the public domain, he had a hard time explaining what it was to average people and justifying it to psychologists. And it's truly profound when you look at it now in the context of, in the fullness of time, and looking at his overall oeuvre. And one of the most important things is one of the first sentences in the 7 Sermons, which is this crowd of ghosts knocks at his door, and he opens the door, and they say, we have been to Jerusalem, where we have not found what we sought. And the point is that we can all get on a jag where we don't find what we ultimately seek. And the example I gave a few weeks ago was the 63-foot yacht, with the name Never Enough, okay, which is sort of, I say that the marina outside my my building here is, filled with monuments to the god of materialism, because people think that they're going to find happiness, that if they only get to this point, if they only get the 63-foot yacht, then they'll be happy. But obviously that person wasn't happy, because Never Enough was the name he put on his boat. And that's the same experience that the ghosts had at the beginning of Never Enough, or I'm sorry, of the first Sermon to the Dead, which was they had been to Jerusalem looking for some sort of spiritual enlightenment, and they did not find it. They did not get it. And one could also imagine that, the Crusaders of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries must have had some idea that they would get closer to God if they only went to Jerusalem. And they maintained the kingdom of Jerusalem for 200 years, and then they came back to Europe because they did not find what they sought there. Thomas says, I wonder if the Mercurius story is related to the Islamic genie thing, a spirit captured in the bottle. Exactly, that's exactly what it is. So let me quickly get through these other 4 things that it is in the summary, and then I'll go and read that story, because that's an important aspect of this. Okay, so number 3, he is a process by which the lower and material is transformed into the higher and spiritual, and vice versa. Okay, so you could think of the process that makes the waterfall go. All right, he is the devil. Okay, so here's what's really interesting. Number 4, he is the devil, a redeeming psychopomp, an evasive trickster, and God's reflection in physical nature. So he's all these things. The spirit is all of these things. He is also, number 5, he is also a reflection of a mystical experience of the artifacts that coincides with the opus alchemicum. So he's the mystical experience which the alchemists were having for 1700 years while they did their work. And we're going to have to talk about alchemy and mystical experiences another time, but if you've ever had one, then you have no need to believe, and so those experiences happen across the world. I was in Buddhism, they call them, people who have had them, the self-sprung ones. And at least that's the English translation from Tibetan Buddhism. And it's actually a religious experience. And I have several of mine on this channel, which you can see for yourself. Mostly they're very hard to catch on video, but I've caught 2 on video, and one of those is the experience with the Pollock, and I've caught 1 in still film, and they are under Breakthroughs to the Unconscious, my playlist called that. You'll find them. And so number 6, as such, he represents on the one hand the self, and on the other the individuation process. And because of the limitless number of his names, also the collective unconscious. So that last description basically makes the spirit anything. Okay, so we'll come back to the summary section, but now I'll go back to the beginning because Thomas is chomping at the bit to hear the the parable. But just before that, 4 more lines, Thomas. I want to just read the opening little bit here at the beginning of this, because this is Dr. Jung's predicate for this essay. And he's here quoting a magic papyrus. He doesn't date it, and I don't have a date offhand, but it's a description of Hermes, and it seems to be in Greek, and so this is the English translation of the Greek. Hermes, ruler of the world, dweller in the heart, circle of the moon, round and square, inventor of the words of the tongue, obedient to justice, wearer of the chalames, shod in winged sandals, guardian of the many-sounding tongue, prophet to mortals. Okay, so that's a pretty all-purpose God. I call that the Swiss Army knife of God. But anyway, so Dr. Jung says, children are still told Grimm's fairy tale of the spirit in the bottle, which is ever living, like all fairy tales, and moreover contains the quintessence and deepest meaning of the Hermetic mystery as it has come down to us today. Quote, once upon a time there was a poor woodcutter. He had an only son whom he wished to send to high school. However, since he could give him only a little money to take with him, it was used up long before the time for the examinations. So the son went home and helped his father with the work in the forest. Once, during the midday rest, he roamed the woods and came to an immense old oak. There he heard a voice calling from the ground, "Let me out! Let me out!" He dug down among the roots of the tree and found a well-sealed glass bottle, from which, clearly, the voice had come. He opened it, and instantly a spirit rushed out and soon became half as high as the tree. The spirit cried in an awful voice, "I have had my punishment, and I will be revenged. I am the great and mighty Spirit Mercurius, and now you shall have your reward. Whoso releases me, him I must strangle." This made the boy uneasy, and quickly thinking up a trick, he said, "First I must be sure that you are the same spirit that was shut up in that little bottle." To prove this, the spirit crept back into the bottle. Then the boy made haste to seal it, and the spirit was caught again. But now the spirit promised a reward to him richly if the boy would let him out. So he let him out and received as a reward a small piece of rag. Quoth the spirit, "If you spread one end of this over a wound, it will heal, and if you rub steel or iron with the other end, it will turn into silver." Thereupon the boy rubbed his damaged axe with the rag, and the axe turned to silver, and he was able to sell it for 400 thaler. Thus father and son were freed from all worries. The young man could return to his studies, and later, thanks to his rag, he became a famous doctor. Okay, so that is the story, and so it is the same story as the genie in the bottle, because the genie, and I think in the Arabian tradition, can grant 3 wishes, and it's the spirit that is granting the wishes. And for example, I had a wish to become a lawyer. Be careful what you wish for. And so, the spirit gave me the strength to become a lawyer. And I wanted to go back to Japan and run a company, and by golly, the spirit took me back to Japan and let me run a company. And I wanted to found a public company, and by golly, I did it in 1994. I founded a company on my back porch with two men from India, two Indian men, and together we created a company that became the largest company in its industry ultimately, and it became a public company. But again, all of these things are be careful what you wish for, because in the case of law, I found that I didn't care for the practice of law. In the case of Japan, I found that no one was saving a job for me back home, and so there was no way to come home comfortably. And in the case of the public company, that was all great until the crash of 2008, when my life savings were lost. And so, the spirit can push you onto something, but you have to be careful what you wish for. And very often they're things that you're not expecting. So the more you know, the better. Okay, let's see. So Andy says, like seeing a UFO or a ghost. Well, it's more than that, Andy. It's actually the spirit that makes you do anything. For example, I have no idea what the next paragraph will be in what I'm saying this evening. No idea whatsoever. But I have every confidence that my spirit will make me say something that will be the next paragraph. And that's true of our entire lives. We can't predict, and almost we cannot create things. We have to have the spirit that pushes you along. And I often think of the scene from Chariots of Fire when Eric Liddell is running in the 440 and he throws his head back, and there's a voiceover that says, "So where does the power come from to see the race through to the end? From within." And then he tells his sister that when he runs, he feels God's pleasure. And those are all spiritual experiences. And this is what always makes me chuckle every time I see a football player point at the sky after he's made a touchdown, because he hasn't understood where the spirit comes from. It isn't to say that God didn't do it. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that God isn't there. God is here. And we haven't understood that yet. But, whatever you do, whatever you are going to be doing 10 minutes from now, you probably can't predict it. And when that time comes, the spirit will move you to do whatever that is. It might be to turn off this live feed, or it might be to go on, or it might be to read along with me as we're talking about this, whatever it is. But that's the spirit coming through you and making things happen. Let's see. So Hermit says, I had one led me on a search for years to find a duplicate account. I'm not sure what you mean by that, but it redefined your life, ended up settling down, accepting it as living waters from the Book of Thomas, or maybe Satori or Tao. yeah, I mean, obviously the idea of getting the genie back in the bottle, getting the spirit back in the bottle was, has to do with harnessing the spirit and making it your friend. And, you know, if you're going to harness the Spirit of God, then it's probably best to know, as Dr. Jung does, and as I claim I do, but I do because I've had the experience, and so I have no need to believe, and I have it very often. For example, and I was talking with my Tibetan Buddhist Lama today about it, and mind you, I'm not a Tibetan Buddhist per se, but I go to a meditation group every week, and part of the reason I do that is because I know that Dr. Jung thought that the Tibetan Buddhists had presented a very interesting parallel to his psychology. And so I'm trying to understand what Dr. Jung was seeing. And what I do see is that almost every week there's a synchronicity between what I'm studying in Jung and what we're talking about in the Buddhist teachings. And so, you know, that's the spirit or something. I don't know what it is. But in any case, and I told Rinpoche today, I said, you know, I don't know why I come to this group every week, because, you know, at my conscious mind level, I really, in many ways, resist it. I don't agree with the way my fellow meditators are addressing the subject, and 5 of them, by the way, are professional psychotherapists, but none of them are Jungian, and so I often get shouted down by these people, and so I said, you know, I told Rinpoche, I don't know why I come every week, but unconsciously, the spirit moves me to come every week. And when I do, I very often have a synchronicity between what I've been studying in the morning on Jungian studies and what happens at the meditation group. So it's a very fascinating experience, but that's the spirits too. Thomas says in writing a book also, the spirit pushes. Sure. I read that essay earlier this evening, and when I sit down to write an essay, I have a very, very general idea of what I'm going to write about, but I simply start to write it, and the spirit comes out through my pen. And so that's definitely a part of that experience. It's as though the boy in the story tricked the spirit using some Mercurius Hermes trickster power to get the magic rag. Sure, absolutely. I mean, you have to grasp that spiritual power. And Thomas says, I sat in meditation with Quakers first time this past Sunday. I'll bet that was an interesting experience. I've thought about going to Quaker meeting because both of my parents were brought up in Quaker environments in Philadelphia, and they both attended Friend Central in Philadelphia. So the Quaker spirit was always around my house in some way. I never have been to a Quaker meeting, but I know what transpires in them, and I think it's interesting. So Jerome says, a good intro to symbolism and the psychology alchemy lectures in 1959 given by Marie-Louise von France, Inner City Books. I'm sure that's very good. Marie-Louise was an excellent writer, and I'm most familiar with her because of the Grail legend, which she wrote based on the research work of Emma Jung, but she's really an excellent writer and very clear. And page 101, the water of life flows between opposites, sun and sulfur, consciousness and moon, Mercurius, spirit of unconscious. Absolutely. Okay, so going back to this, there's a few fascinating things here. And I wanted to cover a couple of other things that are in the summary first. And let me just make sure that those get done. All right, so he's addressing the psychological relationship of the lapis to consciousness. Now, obviously, this is the lapis envisions a material object, and we're in paragraph 287, and this is the quote. And we're talking about the lapis now. This stone is below thee as to obedience, above thee as to dominion, therefore from thee as to knowledge, about thee as to equals. Applied to the self, this would mean the self is subordinate to you, yet on the other hand rules you. It is dependent upon your own efforts and your knowledge, but transcends you and embraces all those who are of like mind. This refers to the collective nature of the self, since the self epitomizes the wholeness of the personality. By definition, wholeness includes the collective unconscious, which, as experience seems to show, is everywhere identical. And so I think that this is important to think about this particular paragraph, because it really shows how broad and diverse this concept of the spirit is. And later on in here, we get into this the Trinity, and one of the ways of referring to the Trinity is body, soul, and spirit. So, the body is obviously material. Soul, I think at this point in time, Dr. Jung had anima and self conflated with one another. So he was really talking about aspects of both when he talked about soul. And then spirit is the energy and information exchange that goes back and forth between the body and the soul. So let me just read this next paragraph here. Paragraph 288. The encounter of the poor student with the spirit in the bottle portrays the spiritual adventure of a blind and unawakened human being. The same motif underlies the tale of the swineherd who climbed the world tree, and also forms the leitmotif of alchemy. For what it signifies is the individuation process as it prepares itself in the unconscious and gradually enters consciousness. The commonest alchemical symbol for this is the tree. the arbor philosophica, which derives from the paradisal tree of knowledge. Here, as in our fairy tale, a demonic serpent, an evil spirit, prods and persuades to knowledge. In view of the biblical precedent, it is not surprising that the Spirit Mercurius has, to say the least, a great many connections with the dark side. One of his aspects is the female serpent demon, Lilith, or Melusina, who lives in the philosophical tree. At the same time, he not only partakes of the Holy Spirit, but, according to alchemy, is actually identical with it. We have no choice but to accept this shocking paradox. After all, we have learned about the ambivalence of the spirit archetype. Our ambiguous Mercurius simply confirms the rule. In any case, the paradox is no worse than the Creator's whimsical notion of enlivening his peaceful, innocent paradise with the presence of an obviously rather dangerous tree snake accidentally located on the very same tree as the forbidden apples. Now, what I wanted to do here is give you this symbol again. This is the symbol of the Spirit Mercurius, and it has some interesting features to it. Of course, this is the Caduceus that you find in medicine, in symbols of medicine. And what it's representing, among other things, is Kundalini, which is a Hindu spiritual practice, where the chakras are represented by the images in different colors going up the Caduceus. And of course you have the two snakes going up. One is the good snake and one is the bad snake. And we should always be thinking about these two snakes and how they're intertwining with one another, because good and bad are relative. And so one man's cake is another man's poison type of thing. And so you may get to some point in time that is perfect and find that it's not so good after all. For example, my becoming an attorney. When I was in Vietnam, I was in a hooch for 3 months with three attorneys, and what they were doing sounded pretty interesting to me. I wasn't an attorney at that time, and so I decided that I should go to law school based on being there. And so that spirit came to me at that time. Basically, the genie in the bottle was presented to me in that hooch, and I let it out enough to sprinkle me with a little lawyer dust, and then I put it back away and let it make me chug along through law school and through 5 years of practicing law. And so it had its good features in several ways. I found it a very interesting experience to go to law school. It was financially good because I had a GI Bill and so on, and it was an interesting challenge. But gradually I found, once I started practicing law, that I really detested the practice of law. And if I had known a little bit better about personality types before I started, I probably wouldn't have, because as it happened, I already had a job I set up to go to work in the banking community. And if I had, I probably would have ended up as one of the 1%ers that I don't think so highly of today. But But that's the way the genie works. That's the way the spirit pushes you one way or the other. And so you can't precisely say that this snake is right and this snake is wrong. And so this process pushes you up through the chakras, and I'm not familiar with Kundalini well enough to discuss it in terms of chakras, only to say that this image is called Caduceus chakra, and it represents the chakra. So for them's knows, it has that relevance, that symbolic relevance also. And then you find the wings, which in that first part that I had read back at the beginning, where he says Hermes is shod in winged sandals. Those wings, those are Akkadian wings, as one of our subscribers refers to herself. And then finally you get up to the self and get to the point where you flower. That's the spirit of the golden flower. So you have to go through a lot of ins and outs and relativity of good and bad to get to the point where you should be from a spiritual point of view. And this is what happens during a lifetime. So it's a representation of getting you from the material you, where you're just a loaf of protoplasm when you're born, to the point where you reach some sort of spiritual level and enlightenment, I suppose. And you get to the point where you have no need to believe you know. So anyway, that's my observations there. Let me see if I... Okay, so I'm just going to read through this next paragraph because it sums up a lot of very important stuff. So paragraph 289, it must be admitted that the fairy tale and alchemy both show Mercurius in a predominantly unfavorable light, which is all the more striking because his positive aspect relates him only to the Holy Spirit, but in the form of the Lapis also to Christ, and as triad even to the Trinity. It looks as if it were precisely these relationships which led the alchemists to put particular stress on the dark and dubious quality of Mercurius, and this militates strongly against the assumption that by their Lapis they really meant Christ. If this had been their meaning, why should they have renamed Christ the Lapis? If this had been their meaning, why should they have renamed Christ the Lapis Philosophorum? The lapis is at most a counterpart or analogy of Christ in the physical world. Its symbolism, like that of Mercurius, who constitutes its substance, points psychologically speaking to the self, as also does the symbolic figure of Christ. In comparison with the purity and unity of the Christ symbol, Mercurius Lapis is ambiguous, dark, paradoxical, and thoroughly pagan. It therefore represents a part of the psyche. It therefore represents a part of the psyche which was certainly not molded by Christianity and can on no account be expressed by the symbol Christ. On the contrary, as we have seen, in many ways it points to the devil, who is known at times to disguise himself as an angel of light. The lapis formulates an aspect of the self which stands apart, bound to nature and at odds with the Christian spirit. It represents all those things which have been eliminated from the Christian model, but since they possess living reality, they cannot express themselves otherwise than in dark hermetic symbols. The paradoxical nature of Mercurius reflects an important aspect of the self, the fact, namely, that it is essentially a complexio oppositorum, and indeed can be nothing else if it is to represent any kind of totality. The Mercurius as Deus terrestris has something of that Deus abscondus, hidden God, which is an essential element of the psychological self, and the self cannot be distinguished from a God image except by incontestable and unprovable faith. Although I have stressed that the lapis is symbol embracing the opposites, it should not be thought of as, so to speak, a more complete symbol of the self. That would be decidedly incorrect, for actually it is an image whose form and content are largely determined by the unconscious. For this reason, it is never found in the text in finished and well-defined form. We have to combine all the scattered references to the various arcane substances, to Mercurius, to the transformation process, and the end product. Although the lapis in one aspect or another is almost always the subject discussed, there is no real consensus of opinion in regard to its actual form. Almost every author has his own special allegories, synonyms, and metaphors. This makes it clear that the stone, though indeed an object of general experiment, was to an even greater extent an outcropping of the unconscious, which only sporadically crossed the border of subjectivity and gave rise to the vague general concept of the lapis philosophorum. Now, one other thing that I wanted to mention here is that this story of the boy in the bottle type thing was referred in here at some point in this 60 pages, so I'm not going to go back and find it, but he's referring to the Bible itself, so I'm reading from the New American Bible, but he's referring to Revelation chapter 20, and so this is an analog to the spirit in the bottle. Revelation chapter 20, the 1,000-year reign. 1. Then I saw an angel come down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the abyss and a heavy chain. He seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, which is the devil or Satan, and tied it up for 1,000 years, and threw it into the abyss, which he locked over it and sealed, so that it could no longer lead the nations astray until the 1,000 years are completed. After this, it is to be released for a short time. Now, Dr. Jung did, in other places in Psychology and Alchemy and so on, talk about the emergence of Satan after the first 1,000 years, but then, of course, we had a new 1,000-year cycle, and just mention Revelation 12:12 here. I think it's 12:12. So in Revelation 12:12, therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great fury, for he knows he has but a short time. And so I think that from the Jungian psychologist point of view, the whole 20th century was a reflection of the fact that this devilish spirit had once again emerged after the second millennium, and it's still with us. And so we all have to think about that and how we get that spirit back in the bottle. I think in the end of the first millennium, the church was pretty much able to do it. But of course, the church's traditional myth sort of ended up with holes in it after the 15th century. And the result was that the spirit spilled out into the horrible 175 million deaths in the 20th century, and it's still happening, and we're still at risk of more happening. And so it's a big issue. Okay, let's see. Okay, I'm not sure that this essay really merits beating to death. It's a very long essay, and basically, okay, there are a couple of other things I want to bring to your attention, and so one of them comes from the dual nature of Mercurius, and I consider this a warning about our times in the United States. But anyway, let's see. Okay, so I'll just start in the middle of paragraph 267. There is the common and the philosophic Mercurius. He consists of the dry and earthy, and the moist and viscous. Two of his elements are passive, earth and water, and two are active, air and fire. He is both good and evil. The Aurelia Occulta gives a graphic description of him. Okay, so this is the description of Mercurius that comes in the Aurelia Occulta. I am the poison-dripping dragon who is everywhere and can be cheaply had. That upon which I rest and that which rests upon me will be found within me by those who pursue their investigations in accordance with the rules of the art. My water and fire destroy and put together. From my body you may extract the green lion and the red, but if you do not have exact knowledge of me, you will destroy your five senses with my fire. From my snout there comes a spreading poison, and that has brought death to many. Therefore you should skillfully separate the coarse from the fine, if you do not wish to suffer utter poverty. I bestow on you the powers of the male and the female, and also those of heaven and of earth. The mysteries of my art must be handled with courage and greatness of mind, if you would conquer me by the power, or if you would conquer me by the power of fire. For already very many have come to grief, their riches and labor lost. I am the egg of nature known only to the wise, who in piety and modesty bring forth from me the microcosm which was prepared for mankind by Almighty God, but given only to the few, while the many long for it in vain, that they may do good to the poor with my treasure, and not fasten their souls to the perishable gold. By the philosophers I am named Mercurius. My spouse is the philosophic gold. I am the old dragon, found everywhere in the globe of the earth. Father and mother, young and old, very strong and very weak, death and resurrection, visible and invisible, hard and soft. I descend into the earth and ascend to the heavens. I am the highest and the lowest, the lightest and the heaviest. Often the order of nature is reversed in me, as regards color, number, weight, and measure. I contain the light of nature. I am dark and light. I come forth from heaven and earth. I am known and yet do not exist at all. By virtue of the sun's rays, all colors shine in me, and all metals. I am the carbuncle of the sun, the most noble purified earth, through which you may change copper, iron, tin, and lead into gold. And he's also a hermaphrodite. Okay. So anyway, that's a warning of our local Spirit Mercurius, I think. The other thing I wanted to just mention, rather than go through all the great detail, what Dr. Jung was doing is going back and addressing spirit in all the ways it was addressed over the last couple thousand years. And so I just want to read off some of the titles here of the sections. One is the connection between spirit and tree. And so all of these things have detailed discussions about them and where the spirit is. The problem of freeing Mercurius, how do you free it? And then in the second part, he talks about Mercurius as quicksilver or water. So it comes in very much as you could imagine water or mercury. If you pour mercury, it's very slippery stuff and hard to catch. And so the spirit comes in like water. And Mercurius as fire, so it gives you the get up and go that you need. Mercurius as spirit and soul, so he's discussing the details of how these ideas developed over 2,000 years. And Mercurius as soul, okay, so under Mercurius as soul, it says, soul represents a higher concept than spirit in the sense of air or gas. As the subtle body or breath soul, it means something non-material and finer than mere air. Its essential characteristic is to animate and be animated. It therefore represents the life principle. Mercurius is often designated as anima. Hence, as a feminine being, he is also called Fomena or Virgo, or as Nostra Anima. The Nostra here does not mean our own soul, but as in Aqua Nostra, Mercurius Nostra, Corpus Nostrum refers to the arcane substance. Okay, then the next section is Mercurius as spirit in the incorporeal metaphysical sense. So that's in the sense that we would talk about it in church. And one of my comments in here is about logos and eros, which is that you need both. And at the end of this, there's a sentence: the psychology Mercurius must therefore possess an essentially antinomian dual nature. And then the next section is called the dual nature of Mercurius, and many examples are given. And of course, I read that one section from this section. Then the unity and trinity of Mercurius. So he's compared to the Trinity, but there's also a Trinity that is body, soul, and spirit. The relation of Mercurius to astrology and the doctrine of archons. Now that did have something that was interesting. Because of his half-feminine nature, Mercurius is often identified. I'm reading from paragraph 273. Because of his half-feminine nature, Mercurius is often identified with the moon and Venus. As his own divine consort, he easily turns into the goddess of love, just as in his role of Hermes, he is ichthyphalic. But he is also called the most chaste virgin. The relation of Quicksilver to the moon, silver, is obvious enough. Mercurius as the shining and shimmering planet, appearing like Venus close to the sun in the morning or evening sky, is like her, a Lucifer, a light bringer. He heralds, as the morning star does, only much more directly the coming of the light. And he's also a senex, which means old man. He also defines Mercurius as a process, and here we're talking about the process of individuation. And he says it begins with evil and ends with good. And so a rather deplorable but picturesque poem on Verus Hermes summarizes the process as follows. A weakling babe, a graybeard look. I'm sorry, let me start that again. A weakling babe, a graybeard old, surnamed the dragon, me they hold in darkest dungeon, languishing that I may be reborn, a king. A fiery sword makes me to smart. Death gnaws my flesh and bones apart. My soul and spirit fast are sinking, and leave a poison black and stinking. To a black crow am I akin. Such be the wages of all sin. In deepest dust I lie alone. Of that the three would make the one. O soul, O spirit, with me stay, that I may greet the light of day. Hero of peace, come forth from me, whom the whole world would like to see. Okay, well, that's certainly a bit of doggerel, but it brings us, then he's talking about Mercurius and Hermes, but I wanted to read this other, okay, so I'm pretty much at the summary, so that just gives you a sense of it, and I urge you, if you want to get into the details of what Mercurius has meant for the last 2,000 years in many, many different ways, you can look at this essay called The Spirit Mercurius. Now, there's one other thing that I wanted to cover tonight, and before I get into that, Soul Life says, I've been enjoying your readings. I'm looking forward to explore Jung's thoughts with the help of your videos. Andy Oxide says, what do you believe is the purpose of human existence? Is God experiencing the universe through us? If so, to what end? Well, Andy, that's the question, isn't it? As Bob Newhart would say, that's the Gazernenblatt. I've separately published a couple of videos on the meaning of life. And Dr. Jung actually addressed that in the beginning of the Red Book. But my conclusion of what he said is that the meaning of life is you, okay? All of us are the meaning of life. We're all the result of successful reproduction going back to single-celled organisms. So, the issue is that God is quite a bit slower than what, Christianity or perhaps other religions want you to believe. I mean, God is not a guy with marionette strings on your arms and legs making you succeed or fail. That's not God. But as Dr. Jung pointed out, the human consciousness, so far as we know, is lighting a candle in the darkness of mere being. And he came to that thought when he was on Mount Elgon in Africa, and he looked down over the plain and saw all these animals and all the begetting and devouring that went on for hundreds of millions of years to produce us, human beings. And so we've gained more and more consciousness. And I did publish a reading a couple of days ago, which is a letter to the Reverend Morton T. Kelsey. I urge you to take a look at that letter. But one of the things he says in that is that the problem that we have is that the religious leaders are looking back toward the beginning of this new consciousness that we have had, that we've had for the last 2,000 years, and rather than pointing forward to where the Spirit is taking us. And obviously the Spirit is at work in 7.5 billion of us, and it is taking us somewhere. We don't know where. And it would be a very good idea if all theologians would start applying their prodigious brain power on where the Spirit is taking us, the Holy Ghost. And so I'm going to talk about how we get taken there and how we learn these things in a moment. But let's see what else we have. And so, Andy, to what end? That's the question we have to start pushing on the theologians. Where is the Spirit taking us? Never mind what happened 2,000 years ago. Where are we going? That's the important question. And okay, and sounds like Spinoza's God to an extent. Yep, that may be. I'm descended from Dutch in one part of my family, so it could be. Okay, and Dr. Jung's Calvinism probably is related to what I'm saying too. Okay, so I'm going to read another short piece here, which is Going to the School of Pain, but I have to find the book that it's in. I have a few books on my desk at the moment. I always try to set all these things up, but then, here it is. Okay, so This comes from Encounter with the Self by Edward Edinger, and it comes from picture 6, and it's about how we find out what we should be and where the self is taking each one of us. And so this was a piece of prose that was written by one of Dr. Edward Edinger's patients, and it was after that patient had experienced some intense pain from renal colic. And so this patient wrote this piece. Going to school to Pain. Pain says, if one would teach, he must first get the student's attention. I am an excellent attention getter. I am deep. If you would not fear me, be deep like me. I come from the center. A point is my sign. A stab from me is the cosmic goad. If you would not fear me, live each present moment with the same intensity that you experience me. I am the great purifier. Only the essential can endure me. All else is burnt away. I am the great valuer. All values come from me and my partner, death. I am the gateway to the mysteries. An image of me is your highest concept of the sacred. I am the quintessential now. I lie in ambush for those who miss their daily dose of life. This elixir, unconsumed, accumulates and overspills its little vial, raining its concentrated torrent on the negligent soul. I am the angel of annunciation for the awesome now. Time is a gliding serpent bearing precious jewels upon its back, each jewel a present moment. And so that's, I guess that's a long way of saying carpe diem. But it also made me think of a reason that many people go to psychotherapy, and what at least Jungian analysts are looking for, which is a defeat, some pain. You come to some point in your life and it's painful, and then you have to ask yourself why. And so James Hillman at one point in one of the lectures he was giving said, can't we find a defeat in here somewhere? And so the point is, we all have defeats in life, and those defeats and they are painful, are our way of finding our way and finding ourself, finding the philosophical gold in ourselves if we can. And so this was a meme that was passing around the internet, and it came to me, and then the next day my wife gave it to me from a Buddhist site, so it must have something to do with both Jungian psychology and Buddhism, and it's called Your Real Self. Meditation is nothing but a device to make you aware of your real self, which is not created by you, which need not be created by you, which you already are. You are born with it. You are it. It needs to be discovered. If this is not possible, or if the society does not allow it to happen, and no society allows it to happen, because the real self is dangerous. Dangerous for the established church, dangerous for the state, dangerous for the crowd, dangerous for the tradition, because once a man knows his real self, he becomes an individual. He no longer belongs to the mob psychology. He will not be superstitious. and he cannot be exploited, and he cannot be led like cattle. He cannot be ordered and commanded. He will live according to his light. He will live from his own inwardness. His life will have tremendous beauty, integrity, but that is the fear of the society. And so I think that that's a very valuable definition to keep in mind. And the church is afraid of Dr. Jung because if you have your own experience of God, then you have no need to believe. You have no need for a creed because you do know yourself. And what I'm trying to convey to theologians like Paul Vanderklee is, one, Paul has agreed to have a conversation with me on Zoom in September, but what I'm trying to convey is that we need to know where the Spirit is going, and Christianity can revivify itself if it addresses that issue and addresses the issue of giving people the experience of God. Because if it's just on he says, she says, then people that are atheists aren't going to get aboard. But if people actually have experience and learn the experience, they will understand it. And of course, this has been used for decades in places like Alcoholics Anonymous, but that's all been kept very hush-hush, and who wants to find out what a 12-step program is if you don't have an addiction, for example. But the reality is that one of the basic tenets of a 12-step program is to have this religious experience that I'm talking about. And if you have it, you know. And if you haven't had it, then it's probably worth your while to try to figure out how it happens. And it does happen. And it happens to me almost every day. It's just a question of recognizing it. But when my daughter told me 20 years ago that she thought I was going to hell on her 22nd birthday, that was quite a astounding experience for me. I did have a psychogenic experience with Mephistopheles as I had envisioned him when I read Faust. Okay, so when I read Faust, I had a vision of what Mephistopheles was like, and that's the vision, that's the image that was in my mind, and that's the image that popped up and plopped down in the seat next to me in my automobile. Now, I think that amounts to a cheap trick, which some sects of Christianity have used to scare people into coming into the church, because if that happens to me, it can happen to lots of people, obviously. And people 100 years ago wouldn't have had the kind of information I have to understand what the significance of such an experience is. But, that was certainly a religious experience in a negative sense. And so I know the power of that particular religious experience. Obviously, I've had many positive ones too. But my point is that, that's a trick to scare people psychologically into coming into Christianity, but that's not the way to do it. And And so somehow that has to get conveyed to Christian theologians in order to, quite literally save Christianity, I think. That's my opinion. Andy says, before Bill W. died, he begged everyone for some whiskey. True story. Okay, maybe he did. But he stayed sober for about 40 years. And so I think that that's a good sign. And considering that I had a grandfather who died of alcoholism, I think that that's a worthwhile thing. And whatever the ineffable may be, it kept Bill W. sober for 40 years. And at the end of his life, he was attributing that success and the success of Alcoholics Anonymous to Dr. Jung. So I think that that's very significant. Let's see. Soul Life says, I'm able to get a general feeling of the references which you're describing. Of course, the more details I am given, the more it gets complicated and vague. I wonder what preparation could help me. Well, I think that the preparation that can help you is simply reading some of the easier Jungian stuff first. Don't just jump into the Red Book, because you won't understand what that is. But read Man and His Symbols, which is a book that Dr. Jung intentionally wrote for laymen, and then read Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And in fact, there's a couple of videos that sort of give you a syllabus on this YouTube channel, which you can find. In fact, lecture number 3, which this is session number 89. If you go back to lecture number 3, which was before we were actually having meetings, when I was just talking to my iPhone back 2 years ago, you will find a syllabus there, and that will tell you how to step through it. What I would say about the Red Book is that the Red Book represents a visioning period that Dr. Jung had, and I think of it as very analogous to the kind of visioning that Job was doing 2,500 years ago, and the kind of visioning that happened to me during my novel writing period in 1993, and so those are religious experiences, and so unless you understand the context of what those are, it's probably not the place to start. But anyway, Soul Life, I recommend that you go back to a playlist called it's called JRG. I think it's called JRG1. Anyway, there's 3 playlists that cover the 3 years that I've been doing this, and the first year is called 1, and then there's 2 and 3, which really cover the years. And right back at the very beginning, if you go back to lecture number 3, you'll find a syllabus. And so, and Andy correctly says you just have to hammer them out. Andy says, I had an antithetical religious experience, but it led me to the same place. This is a fairly well-documented phenomenon. The visioning experience you reference is highly relevant. Yeah. I presume so, because I've had a few of them. That particular experience with Mephistopheles was quite special, of course. But it did make me understand how theologians use the trickster to get people into the pews, okay? And I'd rather have the theologians getting us into the pews because we understand what's happening and where the Spirit is taking us. That's the point. And so I think the fundamental answer is, if I had really thought about it, I probably would not have assigned the Spirit Mercurius as an essay for this group at this point, simply because it's one of Dr. Jung's way too complicated, way too prodigious scholarship, and you can really get lost in the weeds. But I think it's worthwhile to look at. It's in volume 13 of the collected works, Alchemical Studies, and if you look beginning at page 237, that 10 pages is a place to start, because that's the summary, and it's talking about the Spirit. And as I said earlier in this evening, the Spirit is taking us everywhere. It makes all of us do everything we do all day long. And Dr. Jung was only going back and talking about how medieval or early Iron Age men were thinking about this. And, that's well and good, because he felt he had to cover his tracks and have full scholarship, or otherwise it's, hey, I'm Carl and this is my idea, which is the type of stuff that we see on the internet all the time. And okay, you can launch an idea maybe, but geez, you may even get 1 million people to look at your idea. But if you do that on the internet, you haven't given it any staying power. So if it's a cool idea and it just falls away, that's not very powerful. But Dr. Jung did the prodigious scholarship in German, English, Greek, and Latin, and some Arabic, with translations from Chinese, sufficient to establish very clearly what he was talking about. And this is why we're still talking about his work, and he's been dead for 57 years. So, and I suppose people will be talking about him for a lot more. And so Andy says, how did I wrap that experience into my everyday life? Well, I don't know, somehow, because I was already into my Jungian studies at that point, I just kept working at it. And then, I didn't really know at that point, that was 1998, and I didn't even know the Red Book existed until 2009. And so I just kept working on my Jungian work in general, which had already begun, for other reasons, for reasons related to art, to writing, to painting, to my painting. When I started Archetype in Action in 2010, I thought it was mainly going to be to help artists do paintings that were going to be more powerful so that they could sell more, because obviously an archetypal painting is much more grabbing than a painting that tries to be a substitute for a camera. We have an adult education place over here in my city, and I've been to many of those art classes, and you'll see 30 people in the room, and they're all trying to paint a still life, and they're trying to be like a camera. And the thing is, we have cameras for that now. We don't need anybody to paint another picture that looks like a photograph. What we need is for people to paint a picture of that still life that comes from their heart, that comes from their own deep soul. And a few of you have seen some of the paintings I've done. I'm not going to belabor it tonight, but anyway. So gradually it became more important to me, though, Andy, because at the time it happened, I didn't really realize that Dr. Jung's work was very much about religion. So I didn't really understand at that point. Probably I had read across it at some point. I probably didn't understand that Dr. Jung's work was as much about religion as it is, because I didn't even start reading Dr. Jung's actual work until 2005, and I had started reading it in 1987. I had started to read about it, but I hadn't read his direct work because I thought it was about clinical psychology. And it's only in the last 5 years that I've really grokked the fact that it's heavily about religion, and that's been repressed by the professional Jungian analysts and by the institutes. They haven't wanted to talk about the religious aspects of what his work really says and means. And it's only in the last year that a new series is coming out called Jung's Red Book for Our Time. It's actually going to be a 3-volume series. So far, 2 volumes have been published, but that's those essays. There's 50 essays by Jungian analysts, and those essays are addressing this. But, the first one of those books came out in 2017, and so most people don't even understand the religious aspects, or aren't even aware that there are religious aspects in Dr. Jung's oeuvre. And I think that there are many Jungian analysts in the late 20th century, early 21st century, who had no clue about the Red Book, for example, never had any idea. And I know I visited a Jungian analyst in 2015, and she said that she had never read the Red Book, and I go, what? And so it's only that way that I've gotten into it. I just have kept at it, and I've kept at it, as I've said several times, and I'll say it once more. Whenever I'm in mental turmoil, and that is fairly frequently for a variety of reasons, and I think most people get themselves in mental turmoil one way or another. But as I started to get into the depths of Jung, I realized that it was actually serving for me like psychotherapy does. And so Dr. Jung is really my shrink, and even though he has been dead for 57 years, and I can pick up any piece of his work, anything at all, and start reading it, and immediately I think I enter this psychoid layer that I've talked about in previous videos, and it soothes me, it soothes my mental turmoil, and so it serves as psychotherapy for me. And people think that this is, this is just airy-fairy stuff or something. A lot of scientific method folks and other types of psychotherapists might say that, but, for lack of depth psychology, last year we lost 62,000 people to the opioid epidemic. So that's doctors who are, among other things, treating people with depression through opioids instead of getting to what really ails them at depth. And that's shameful. And I've said a couple times also that, very simply, we don't understand ourselves. And until we do, we are at risk of destroying the human race. And Dr. Jung saw that threat in his lifetime. He said so in his interview for the BBC. And it's very clear to me today. And all we have to do is look at the Spirit Mercurius as it has been represented by the trickster in modern American politics, and you can see the risk that we have. My 20 years of my time in the Marine Corps was mainly aimed at the threat, quote unquote threat, which was the Soviet Union. And we have a president that looks awfully cozy with Russia today. And that is truly threatening to me. That's very frightening. And what's more frightening is that a lot of my peers, people my age who've served in the military, think it's perfectly okay what he's been doing. And I don't think that at all. And so, whatever. Those are my observations. I think I better terminate this at this point because we're over the 2 hours. And so I'm not sure if I'll be able to, whether part of this will be truncated. But thank you all for joining me this evening. I'll have to think about what to talk about next week because I'm going to cop out on getting into the great nitty-gritty detail of the Spirit Mercurius. I'm just going to tell you that the Spirit Mercurius is everything that makes us do things. And so we need to understand ourselves. And I think that there's some other things that are more important in Dr. Jung's oeuvre. So I may continue some of these alchemical studies. Let's see, there is one other thing that I wanted to mention, and that is there's this question about astrology. So I think that's useful. So he's talking after the 6 things that we talked about at the beginning. In paragraph 285, he says, certainly gold making, as also chemical research in general, was of great concern to alchemy, but a still greater, more impassioned concern appears to have been, one cannot very well say the investigation, but rather the experience of the unconscious. That this side of alchemy was for long misunderstood is due solely to the fact that nothing was known of psychology, let alone of the superpersonal collective unconscious. So long as one knows nothing of psychic actuality, it will be projected, if it appears at all. Thus the first knowledge of psychic law and thus the first knowledge of psychic law and order was found in the stars and was later extended by projections into unknown matter. These two realms of experience branched off into sciences, Astrology became astronomy, and alchemy chemistry. On the other hand, the peculiar connection between character and the astronomical determination of time has only very recently begun to turn into something approaching an empirical science. The really important psychic facts can neither be measured, weighed, nor seen in a test tube or under a microscope. They are therefore supposedly indeterminable. In other words, they must be left to people who have inner sense for them, just as colors must be shown to the seeing, not to the blind. And so I thought I would read that simply because people often mistake that alchemy is about making gold, and it wasn't about that at all. And alchemists were kept around by kings because they were making chemicals that were worth something to the kings in various ways. Right, Andy Oxide says, people miss the fact that alchemy unveils the experiential psychic actuality. The allegorical references are universal in religious beliefs. And so, yes, I think that's a good point, and it's a point that I'm going to close on. So thank you all for joining tonight, and I will put an announcement on this page, on the live page, on what next week will be about. I'll have to give that some thought, and I have our advanced reading group tomorrow, so it won't be for a couple of days. But at various times you'll be able to see what it is if you check back on this URL and see what I'm planning to talk about next week. So thank you so much for joining tonight, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week.